This is the Kestrel Country Podcast, where we discuss the people, places, and events all around Kestrel Country. Jed, Kris.
I'm all ready. Am I coming through loud and clear, like normal, loud and clear?
I can't hear you. It's Mike who can hear you on that one.
No, yeah, I can hear you guys. That's
Okay,
good.
good.
You don't need to get too close. It's good.
Okay, Jed's loud and clear at all times.
Jed's always loud.
I'm good back
Yeah,
here.
Jed, if
Yeah,
you
you
could
hear
just
me?
back up,
Me and you gotta lean
that would
back.
be great.
Yeah.
Good.
All right.
Yeah, so we're supposed to talk about the year in review. And I'm guessing that they meant 2022 because there's not much
Of
2023
Yeah.
to review.
And I can't remember
at this point.
2021, so.
So yeah, new year, exciting. Any big things going on yet this year?
Yeah. I had a nice closing January 3rd. I started off the year
true.
right. First quarter is well on its way. In fact, it's probably the best January I've had in the business. Yeah. So
And it's only a few days in.
that's right. What could
Way
be
to go.
better, right?
Yeah. So what would, I don't know, maybe we start out this way. Jed, if you could distill down this last year in real estate in particular, talking about real estate first. We can talk about hunting later because I know that was an amazing year. How would you characterize 2022 in real estate?
2022 in real estate, I think top of the mountain. I think that was 2022. I feel like people were waiting since COVID hit. Like there was this pressure that everybody was like, where's the cap? You know, where's the top of the mountain with prices, with buyer interest?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a question we had, you know, and we kind of reevaluate. Well, I mean, interest rates are still low. So yeah, it's not a bad time to buy. And I feel like it all built up to the spring of 2022 when I know at least I was like uncomfortable looking at kind of those different areas. Like, okay, interest rates have started to climb. Prices are, 45% higher than 3 years ago. Where's the top? It was like we were getting close and we didn't quite know how it was going to shake out, especially with how the government throws their arm into things nowadays. And so I feel like 2022 for me was like almost a relief, like, hey, we've hit the cap. And now we're going to kind of see whether we have a saddle and then another mountain or whether we're going down a mountain. That's what we're all kind of, figuring out right now. That's kind of how I see 2022. I don't know what you guys have, kind of tying into that.
Yeah, no. I think, to stay on that theme, I printed out a few just charts and it was interesting. I mean, here's one, for example. I mean, that's a mountain right there.
Oh, yeah.
So
That's Moscow Mountain, 3 peaks.
Moscow Mountain, yeah. And this was total number of listings sold. So just, number of units sold. So this is a different type of metric than what you're really talking about. But
Yeah.
I just thought that was interesting when you mentioned mountain. I was like, yeah, I mean, we see, and this is actually a pretty typical, I would say, chart because this is just over
Winter,
the calendar
spring,
year.
fall,
So you kind of have, the spring major spike in how many listings sold. And this is just in Moscow residential. But I do think it's kind of interesting to see too, to illustrate to people. A lot of times I've used that and it's about true for years in real estate, about 30 homes sell per month. And on average, you look across this, about 30 homes sell per month. We have kind of a peak of almost 50, in
Right
that kind of
around-
late spring, June, actual closings.
Right, and that
then tapers
shows
back off.
all that
So this
activity in
one
the
is,
spring.
this isn't really what you're talking about for prices, but I just thought it was kind of interesting.
It's also interesting.
I
to
just do like the Jay Leno thing or whatever.
No, I think we should look at this one more time. Because
Okay.
Mike was always talking about this when we started, and this is so true right here. You look at this, and you see we always talk about slows down at the start of school. And I feel like, and again, this is sold, so, it's a little bit off. But
Right.
I felt like it was really true this year,
Oh, yeah.
especially with the interest rates going up.
Right.
We got into late summer, and it was dead for a while.
Yeah.
And then it was like October. Everybody that needed to buy or wanted to buy, I feel like there was this second little surge, second little peak of we got to get into something before the snow flies.
Right.
and we're locked in. Even with the higher interest rates and uncertainty in the market, people still needed somewhere to go, and I feel like we did. It's kind of interesting. There's that second peak on the chart there of that little push before the winter, and it died off. I don't know if you saw that this year, but
Oh yeah, for
I feel
sure.
like every year you see that.
Yep. Well, I mean, and in terms of talking about, since we are about prices, this doesn't show Jed's mountain, your mountain that you're talking about. But if you string it together, what I did was pull 2020, 2022, or 2021 and 2022. So going back to 2020, this is average and median prices per month. So you can see kind of the chart. And it's not going to follow the same because it's not the volume of sales, right? But we're looking here in kind of right around 300, and this is all residential. So it includes condos, it includes manufactured homes, right? Right around that 300 mark, with a few spikes and a little bit of a trend upwards in 2020 into kind of the mid 300s.
So 2 years ago.
Yeah, and then you've got 2021. You look, we're kind of starting there again in the 300s, moving way up, much closer to 400, and sustaining that growth in price, right? Up into the closer to 400. And then this last year was when we really saw your peak, right?
Yeah.
We see going from that kind of right around 400 up to dang near 500 by that kind of July, which those were home sales that were being made in June, right? Kind of June felt like the peak in a lot of ways. And we were across all residential in Moscow, again, condos, manufactured homes, everything, all the way up to about $500,000. And then you start to see, unlike the last 2 years where it was a pretty steady kind of upward trend towards the end of the year, we start to see in that dropping off back into that kind of by December, end of the year, back below 400 again. So that definitely kind of feels that peak. What about, so Jed had the mountain peak. Kris, how would you characterize this last year?
Well, the funny thing is, so we had the pandemic, right? And mortgage rates, because of the pandemic and the lockdown, 2020, 2021 were probably the lowest I've ever seen in my life, probably the lowest historically ever. And then in 2022, as mortgage rates started to climb, people got, like Jed said, a little panicky. I'm going to miss out, and the fear of missing out, the FOMO and all of it. Plus, the cost of borrowing was relatively cheaper than people had ever seen before in their entire lives.
No kidding.
People were out there actively bidding up any listing that they saw that kind of fit their needs. And I think that frenzy from the beginning of 2022, where if you looked at the 30-year mortgage rate in 2022 in January, it was between 3 and 3.5.
Okay.
People were on a mission, and they were flush with money. And I think that rates being held that low for that long between 2020 and 2022 might have been a policy mistake, because now Jerome Powell and the Fed, they went nuts trying to put the kibosh on inflation. So the 2022 year was this big roller coaster spectrum. And there's a quote that I have on my phone. I'm trying to see if I can find it, where it says, headlines do more to terrify rather than verify. So when people started to, what people's perception is versus reality motivates people. It's what makes people move. And, for me, historically, like today is the day that the iPhone was first put out in 2007. But my age gives me the experience of like 4 economic cycles in my adult life. So I see this, and I see what's happening what I saw happening in 2022 was people really starting to get nuts in the middle of the year, primarily in the spring buying season, feeling like we've got the money, we've got the opportunity, we've got to move on it now. Yep. And then the second half of the year, as mortgage interest rates started to climb higher and higher and higher, really, even though the 2022 average was 5.26, by October, we were approaching 7% to borrow on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And what that did is it sucked the buying power out of the starter home market.
Oh, yeah.
It just crushed people. So I have a lot of clients that are working with their first home buyers, and it just took the wind out of their sails. So for me, like 2022 was great until about July, August at the peak, the mountaintop that Jed's talking about. And then it's been a steady decline into 2023 of people's expectations, people reading headlines, and people's perception that this is absolutely the worst thing that could ever happen to me as a first-time home buyer or somebody looking to move up, because now I have less buying power. And my job has primarily been to kind of talk people down off the ledge in the last quarter of 2022 in preparing them for lower interest rates eventually and getting ready to step up. And I always tell people there's never a bad time to buy a home if it's affordable. The affordability factor has dropped dramatically.
Yeah, that was another mountaintop in 2022 was the affordability just got hammered. Ridiculous.
But so now people are like resetting their expectations and working towards that. So my 2022 has been great, but it's also been challenging as far as trying to help people fix expectations in reality. And me being able to tell people, I bought my first house in 1980. I got a sweetheart deal. But in 1980, mortgage interest rates were 13.25%. That was the average.
Yeah.
The year I bought my first home.
So that scares me. Not scares me, but when people, when you bring something like that up, and you've been through cycles and all that kind of thing, what would you tell somebody who says, well, gee, I mean, if they were 13% when you bought your house, who's to say, like, why aren't they going to be 13% coming up?
Because
like what's the reason why those interest rates won't just keep growing and going up?
Well, I tell people, like, take a breath of air, right? You fill your chest, your lungs fill up, and then you have to exhale. That's what happens, macro economy. It's like breathing. Things go in a cycle, and you just have to be comfortable knowing and trusting and looking at the historical numbers. The numbers don't lie, and they're a pretty good predictor of the future. So don't look at today's headlines. Play the long game. If you want to get into a house and you're tired of paying rent and you want to build some equity, there's never a better time than the present to do it, to start that journey. So I always tell people, stop dreaming and start doing. Don't get locked into fear by reading headlines, looking at interest rates. If you can afford to get into a house at 7.5%, it might not be the house that you wanted to be in, but it's a whole lot better. This is first-time home buyers, a whole lot better than sitting there paying somebody else's mortgage off for them.
Yeah.
So I always try to play the long game in people's minds and get them used to that and understanding that.
Yeah. So you mentioned affordability. One of the things that I guess one of the ways I would characterize 2022 would be a low inventory availability, right?
So hard.
Like so tough. And that was happening around the nation. That was why we saw a lot of this. But particularly like rising prices, all of that pressure, I think so much of it made sense. And then the limited inventory, I think particularly poignant here, is what led to a lot of the bidding wars,
Right.
like you were talking about, bidding stuff up that was still high when it was listed, but then it would get to the outrageous, right? They would just go up because there was that perception that, well, we need a house, which is not just a perception, that's reality. There are people who need a home, and there's nothing else out here. There's no availability. And that's one of the things I think is interesting that hasn't really changed that much yet.
Yeah.
So one of the things that'll be really interesting is going into the spring, because typically, like we saw that volume go up. This volume goes up in the spring because there's more availability. There's options for people to buy. So will we get a lot more inventory, or will it get snatched up? And getting snatched up was what we really saw. I mean, there was some drop in overall volume of sales. But so here I've got average days on market. Oh. And this is, again, residential and residential. So all of residential for just the city of Moscow. I didn't do this for Latah County. Got some of those numbers in a minute. But here we show the average of active and sold days on market. And right there in January, this is again not atypical. People are kind of slow over the winter, over Christmas and stuff. Things tend to sit a little bit longer. But dropped way down to active, almost nothing. And then of sold listings, still very, very low days on market. But then we saw the same time that there was the peak that we talked about was when days on market started to grow.
Right.
And we just saw that grow and grow and grow to where active days on market average, now approaching a couple months.
Yeah.
Whereas that hasn't been the case for a long time. So it'll be interesting, I think, to follow this chart going into this new year to see, okay, are days on market going to start dropping back down again as we get into spring with more churn in the inventory, or are homes just going to sit a little bit longer? I don't know. What are your thoughts, Jed?
Yeah, I think, some of it is up to the sellers. I think we're going to see, how people want to price their home. Some of it's going to be up to how the realtors are talking to them, how those listing conversations are going. Because obviously I would do the same thing as a seller. You want the price you saw last year.
Right.
2022 at the top of the mountain. So it's going to be really tough and it is already, we're having those conversations with people like, look, your home may be worth 5%, 10% less.
Yeah, maybe 10.
Than it was at the peak. And that's just the reality of it. And again, that's not something to be scared of, because you look back and you go, well, you sold your house at that 10% higher price and you bought this one at that 10% higher price at a low interest rate. You're not in a bad spot.
Well, not only that, but from the peak, when was the peak? Peak was June, right? So it's dropped quickly, but when you compare it to 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there's still been a ton of appreciation.
Great shape.
Which is, and that's something that I always used to tell, and still do tell people, is like, real estate is an awesome long-term investment. Yeah. But generally speaking, unless you're doing some particular, flip, you've got some value add you're doing.
You got the right price.
Right.
Otherwise, it is a long-term investment. You're probably 2+ years to really, make money on a piece of property. And so, the idea that, oh man, if I bought this home in June and I had to sell it in December, I'm going to lose money. It's like, well, yeah, you probably, historically, you generally would have.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Appreciation generally takes time.
And I'm sure you guys have had some of those conversations, but I've had people reach out that have bought in the last 2-3 years, like, oh man, what's up with this house? We might want to, upsize. Or, hey, we want to buy some acres. We like we're starting to like some of these prices we're seeing.
Yeah.
And it's like, it goes both ways. Your home sale has also come down.
Yeah.
So it's just something that's good to remember. I think that's going to, kind of back to your question, that's going to affect days on the market. I think overall the average for this 2023 is going to be higher than 2022.
Oh, yeah.
I think they're going to sit longer. And not necessarily because homes are overpriced, but just because the demand's going to be lower. People are going to be a lot more thoughtful in their home buying process. Maybe not even, the price overall, maybe the price, the seller takes a 10K, 15K price cut, small percentage, but it sat a while, buyer looked at it a couple times and it sold for under asking. Whether that's a big dip overall in the average sales price, we'll see, but with the low demand, low supply, I don't see them. I don't think we're going to see the backside of Mount Everest coming down.
Right.
I think it's going to be a gradual transition based off rates.
Yeah, and when you think about rates, right? So the traditional. Well, let's talk about returns. The average traditional return on your residential home, the home you live in, has been about 5%. That's the average since they've been tracking it. 5% per annum. So these unusual spurts of equity wealth, equity buildup, have gotten people's expectations, like you said, unrealistic. But also, coupled with that is the fact that we've got a market. I looked at the last 25 years, and there's only been 1 or 2 years in that span where we've had what's called a balanced market. We're still in the seller's market.
Yeah, in terms of absorption rate, days on market.
Yeah, we've got 30 actives right now in the city of Moscow. And if you back out everything but single family homes with acreage, there's 18 homes for sale. And it's a wild guess is between 350 and a couple $1 million. So there's really that low inventory thing keeps it a seller's market no matter how you look at it.
Yeah. So if we go back to this, what I was saying earlier,
Yeah.
on average, about 30 sell per month.
Right.
And in January last year is about, in that kind of 15
Yeah.
range. So we have about 1 month
Of
worth
supply
of
versus
inventory
6
right
months of
now,
supply.
which 6 months is
So
traditionally
that
considered
artificially props up the buyer, the seller's market, and the price rate. It'll slowly go down, and they're predicting probably an average, like at the mortgage average, probably 6.1 to 6.2% this year, according to a lot of economists that track real estate and residential real estate rates. So people, if they think they're going to get down to 3% again in this year, it's an unrealistic expectation. If you've got a need for a home, there's nothing wrong, like Gordon Ramsay said, buy a house that you find that fits your budget, no matter what the rate is, because you can always refi in the future.
Yeah.
You can always turn around and refi. Did you refi during the time that mortgage rates were low?
I did.
Yeah.
I think
How
most
many
everybody
people
did.
Right, exactly.
I think most everybody who is a home either bought or refied
Right.
during that time
A
period.
lot of turnover.
Right?
Yeah.
And so one of the big questions has been, what's that going to do to our continuing inventory going forward? Because if I keep using this illustration, if you own your home now and your interest rate is, let's just use 3%, right? 3%, right around there. How much motivation would you need to sell that house and sell that mortgage, so to speak,
Right.
right? And rebuy at
Double.
6,
Double it.
6.5, right? You'd have to have, and some people do have that motivation, right?
There
Like
are
whether
motivated
their
people.
family's growing, whether they're
That's
taking
the
a new
key.
job somewhere else, whether they're underwater, whatever it might be. So there will be inventory, but that inventory overall is going to be, I think, suppressed while interest rates are high because of that lack of, right? It's going to be so much harder, certainly from a monthly payment standpoint,
Right.
to take that and go and buy something new. And so I think that's going to keep prices relatively high because at the end of the day, right, it's high school, junior high economics, supply
Right.
versus demand.
It's simple
And as long as the supply stays low and we do continue to have healthy demand, it's going to keep those prices relatively high. And I think that's a factor to kind of watch. One of the things I think will be interesting about here is what's our main economic driver, right? It's the university.
Yeah.
And university towns always have turnover. That's one of the things that's kept our market pretty hot over the years,
Yeah.
even during other economic lulls, is that there's turnover. Professors get jobs elsewhere, grad students graduate and move on, right? Like we're kind of a transient type of population here. Yeah. So as inventory comes up, what's that going to do? How much will that play into potential drops in price is going to be really interesting to see. But right now, I would say what I've felt is a bit of what I would say is like a normalization. When I first got into this business, I would show someone the same house 2 or 3 times over the span of a week or so, before they made an offer. And that was unheard of the last couple of years,
Oh, no.
right? It's like,
Yeah.
well, we can actually only be here for 20 minutes because there's more people coming in behind us and they're reviewing offers in a few hours, right? Like it just got crazy.
Yeah.
And now I think it like you said, Jed, it's less necessarily of the home like just sitting on the market because it's overpriced, and more just everybody's got a little more breathing room, a little more time to think. There's a little less general frenzy. And that's kind of, I think, honestly, very, very healthy because people are able to make better, more informed decisions and not these knee jerk, like, hey, you gotta bid more for this house just because somebody else also wants it. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of that's going to continue, but recapping 2022, I'm glad that that's kind of like we're starting to transition.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think that last quarter of 22 was the start of the big transition of expectations from buyers and sellers. So sellers are now realizing, wow, maybe I did miss that big bubble where I could have asked the moon and gotten it from my house. And buyers are now in a position to say, wow, okay, now I have a chance to compete for a house that I want. If I find something that's affordable for me, I've got a good shot of being able to actively put in an offer and have a chance at getting that house without going way above and beyond asking price. Sometimes I can maybe submit an offer that's lower than the asking price and actually get some negotiation on price going on. So I'm excited to see this transition. I'm excited to see this change. And, people realizing that they're not going to see 3% again, maybe for quite some time. But at least at 6%, I'm only 100 basis points above a historical average. And if prices drop lower, then it becomes more economically feasible. 2 or 3 years down the road, while I'm in that house, I can refi if the rates make it feasible and move forward. So for me, 2022 was a big transition year. It was literally like the seesaw on its fulcrum and then teetering down towards like the norm instead of a blip in the history of buying houses and selling houses. Now we're gonna go back to some normalcy.
Yeah. What about vacant land? Jed, you mentioned in passing, like somebody saying, yeah, maybe it's time for me to sell my place and go build out there.
Yeah.
What are you seeing as far as that goes, or what did you see in the last year? And maybe give us a little bit of insight into construction, what construction, cost did and that kind of thing in the last year.
Yeah. Oh, we got a visitor. You should build up on
You should jump in here, really. But.
You could tag team with me. You could take my headphones.
Good morning. You're on the podcast. Good.
Yeah.
Please edit me out.
I feel like raw land prices did the same thing. We saw some, I feel like we saw those prices peak, and honestly, same thing with inventory.
Yeah.
I feel like inventory's come down too, and I think a lot of it could be, sellers of that raw land, especially raw land, they don't need to sell.
Right.
Oftentimes it's inherited land, or, a farmer getting rid of some scab ground, land that's been in the family, something like that. Less motivation for people. I helped some people in the last couple of years that, split up some land. I know, Mike, you've done the same thing. Split up some land, subdivided it to sell some 5-10 acre parcels because the prices were so good.
Right.
And I think they still are obviously historically high, and we'll still see that, but I think at a lessened amount. And I think a lot of people shied away from that due to the building costs in the last couple of years.
Uncertainty.
We all help people that, the initial phone call is, hey, we're looking for a house for $750,000, or we're interested in land to build.
Yeah.
And I feel like the last couple of years, it's been, I know in the back of my mind right away, you're not going to be able to build that 5'3", 3,500 square foot house by buying a $200,000 piece of acreage, and then it's not going to happen. You're not going to get the shop in the house on it. I mean, it was just right away I knew.
Yeah.
Eventually we found that conclusion down the road. Maybe that'll start to transition. If we see these land prices come down a little bit, I know we've talked about lumber's down right now. Some things like metal are up, but I think, contractors, trade jobs, you look nationally, and the spec house market, the production market for houses, all the builders took a big step back.
Yeah.
As far as their big plans, for pumping out subdivisions or spec houses. I think that's going to slow, and so some of those builders are going to transition more to custom homes, find their little niche again, which is going to provide more building opportunities, I think, for people buying land. And maybe the prices, we'll see some normalization in the material prices and the availability of subs, contractors there. It'll be something to look for.
What's still unusually high, in your opinion, as far as, is it windows, trusses, siding, the cost of pouring a foundation, the cost of putting a road in?
Yeah, I think a lot of the stuff, I think we're still riding the tailwind on a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
Trusses are still high, demand's still up. And what's normal anymore? That's what everybody's trying to. Is it high, or is it just normal?
Yeah.
I know metal's high right now, but overall lumber's
come
70% down from what it was a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good sign. I know concrete, it went up a little bit on the new year.
Yeah,
but,
that's what I'm saying.
Not astronomical. So
yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see if. So one of the things that I saw driving a lot of that vacant land and lots in town, like any kind of vacant land, was somewhat speculative. I had people buying land. One, as a hedge against inflation. That was something we heard a lot, was like, this is a hedge against inflation. Two, without any definite plans to build in the next,
Down the road. It's
years.
down
It was
the road.
more down the road.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting, I think, to see, will some of those parcels that got bought, now that construction costs maybe are coming down a little bit,
There's a
will
lot of
those
people
get
with raw
built
land.
on,
Yeah.
or will that change? And one of the big things I saw from the raw land was folks from out of the area, right? And I think it will be interesting. One of the trends I saw over the last year, certainly last couple of years, but particularly 2022, was the remote work thing, right? People moving from out of the area, able to kind of move wherever they want to move, and that live wherever they want to live, work from home, and finding Idaho very attractive, because of policies, because of the environment, all those kind of things here. Finding Moscow very attractive as a small college town, all those kind of things. And I think we saw a big boom from that. And that was part of what drove things way up, right? Was did we see this boom that, will be unsustainable because fewer people are moving? I tend to think it's going to continue. I know that, Amazon's laying off a lot of people.
At
I
a
know
slower
that
pace,
some
is
people
my
are
opinion.
clawing back workers, trying to get them back in the office. Like, that will affect things. But what I do think is a good, I don't know. I think it is the optimistic side is certainly, there is still such a labor shortage, tech labor in particular. I was talking to a guy who works from home, and he was basically like, look, if you're willing to work hard and work from home, there are so many tech companies that'll hire you right now because they're hungry for that. And so even if, let's say, Microsoft says, you got to come back to the office, you can't work remote anymore. Somebody working for Microsoft is going to have other remote work options.
Right.
Even though these companies are clawing workers back, it has become more normal.
Right.
It's normalized to a point that I think has really benefited communities like Moscow.
So I think it's going to continue, but I think it's going to slow down a little bit. The pace is slowing down. I think not the big rush, but the initial move, like the early adopters of that lifestyle, that's happened over the last 2 years, 2.5 years. People migrating to other areas, desirable areas that fit their lifestyle goals. But I think it will slow down a little bit, mainly because of where the economy is. Software engineers, somebody, like you said, somebody's going to lay somebody off because they're overstaffed, and then somebody that's needy is going to pick all of those qualified, experienced individuals up. So
one last bit of data. I like data. As we're going through this, again, talking about Moscow, we could look at all of Latah County. All Latah County, a number of things. So residential land across different things. What we saw, and you're not going to be able to read this, so you're going to trust me. Trust me, that's the case. Is that we saw really a drop in quantity sold from a year previous. So from 2021, 2022, a drop in the overall number sold. In some categories, including like residential income, an overall drop in volume. So even with an average sale increase in residential income of 29%, that's year over year. So that's a huge increase, right? In residential income, it still didn't account for how much less volume there overall was. Median sale price up 44%.
that's hard to believe.
In residential income.
And the rents didn't track that.
And rents didn't track that.
Yeah.
Rents didn't track that. And I think that was a category too where we saw inventory overall, just like that current volume down. Volume was down 26% from the year before. So like the number of residential income properties, duplexes up to fourplexes, right, that were available was so low that we saw those bidding wars, which kind of fascinated me. As somebody who's like, I always kind of like the commercial and the residential income side because generally speaking, it's a little more rational, right? It's like, if it works, great. If not, versus like I can see totally bidding up and like paying whatever price for
I think the resi income investor is more financially astute than the average person. And most of them have been doing it for a long time. And if I'm sitting with a chunk of money, whether it's rent receipts or something else, and it's sitting in a low interest bearing savings account or money market account, I want to put that money to work. And if it's going to take me 5 to 10 years to realize my profit, I'm way more comfortable doing that than laddering it in CDs or letting it sit in a money market account. That's, when you get the big picture, you've got people that have a ton of money in other securities, and then they've got a chunk of change they want to put to work. And it's almost, not that it's irrelevant, but they don't mind it not cash flowing. They're not using cash flow to support a long-term goal. They're using the slow increase, whether it's 5, 10, 15 years down the road, in equity.
Yeah, and I think
investment. They're not trying to get that investment to give them an instant return.
Well, that's a good perspective, but I do know there were a lot of people who, honestly, not too dissimilar from NFTs and crypto and that kind of stuff, who just were not sophisticated investors. They weren't, and they were just like, man, I want to get into that. Like, I want to get into NFTs, and I'm going to buy myself a duplex. And that's where, there just may be some pain for a little while. And I do agree. Like, hopefully that, be able to stick it out. I think as long as employment stays strong, people can continue to maybe subsidize that investment for a few years, that kind of thing, it'll be good. But I do think that frenzy, I think land and investment properties were both areas where we saw a little bit of frenzy, just like we did in some of these other tech stocks and that kind of thing, where people just had excess cash. Right. And they were like, all right, I don't want to necessarily put it into the stock market, so I want to put it into real estate. Yeah. And that blew it up a little bit, and there's going to be some consequences.
Well, now you see the stock market lower. I think, kind of like you said, the people that do have the excess funds, I think they are going to want that. They're going to look a lot closer for that residential income property to pencil out. Right. Otherwise, why not start looking at the stock market? Right. After we've seen the dip that we've seen. It's not as attractive in the real estate market.
So I'm happy 2022 is, to me, a transitional thing. Transitioning to normalcy or historical normalcy. And that's going to be a good thing for my clients, our clients, and for us. I mean, we're going to have to weather it, but the best way, I think, is the lesson I learned from 2022 is just stay in front of people and be a guide, be helpful, give them helpful information, and help them walk through this and keep a historical perspective on things.
Yeah. Good. Closing thoughts?
That was mine.
Kris had one. Jed, closing thought?
Yeah, I think you really need to find a realtor you can trust that's going to work hard for you, and you need to sit down and pencil things out.
Yeah, and one of the three of us, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, you got 3 options.
Yeah.
Don't pick the ugly one, and we'll be good.
Oh, wait.
Is that me? Yeah. No, I think really look at talk to a lender, figure out your monthly payments, make sure you're comfortable with it, especially if you're a first-time home buyer.
Yes.
You really need to pencil things out. Because if you got a low down payment, you got to make sure, like Mike said, it's a long-term investment. Yeah. You're not going to be able to buy and sell again in a year if you decide to move and make money on it. Yeah. You need to, unless you're putting 10% down. If you put 10% down, well, let's say you got 5% and 6% in closing costs, you lose a little bit of equity in the home even, the market went down another 4%, you're fine, right? You're
Right.
not under the water.
Right.
But if, some of these lower down payment mortgages that we have nowadays, 3.5%, 3% down, really figure out, you need to know your long-term plan.
Right.
You need to know what you can afford for your monthly payment, look at your job stability. It's just get somebody you can sit down with, lender, realtor, make a game plan and stick to it.
I like that.
Don't let emotions get in the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Well, you kind of stole my closing thought. My closing thought was just that long term, right? It's like real estate is a long term investment.
Yeah.
And it's a great long term investment. I love it. I'm going to continue to invest in real estate, so I believe in it. And as long as you have that long term goal, I think this is a great year to potentially buy an investment property, to look into doing something. And like you said, Kris, like don't let fear and uncertainty, maybe lack of information, dictate what you're going to do. And if the best thing is to hold off for a year or two, just hold off for a year or two. Like this is a long term deal.
Hold off for the reasons. Right. I feel like that's something we all learned, and buyers learned this last year. Everybody waiting for prices to come down. Well, here they are coming down, and it's harder to afford a home.
Right.
And I feel like that was good for me, to see and be able to relay to people. Don't wait for a change, unless you need to.
Right.
Look at your personal situation. Don't go, hey, we can get ahead if we wait for the change.
Yeah.
Because there's always something there. Yeah. There's a cost, right?
You're going to chase the market, and you're going to
Yep.
chase it in the wrong direction.
Yep.
Yeah.
And housing is still short. Overall, nationally, there's still not enough housing. So it's a good place to be. So, well, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Hunting next time.
Next time it's the hunting year in review, which will be all Jed talking about his success.
I'll be here nodding my head. I won't even get invited to do this podcast.
I shot a pheasant.
Yeah.
That was great.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
All right. See you guys.
Thanks for joining us. Like, share, subscribe. We'll see you next week.